definite structure to our conversation, but just following up on what Sandy said, I thought one of the things that came to my mind as I looked through your publications and your research career was that you were ahead of your time, but I had a different impression, which was a lot of the terms you were using to describe your research over the years were things like adaptive, pattern recognition, learning, cybernetics, and today these are very hot terms. And also you explained that you're interested in observing data and then trying to draw inferences from data first. And so this whole field is blown up, essentially. People call it machine learning, data sciences, and you've really been working in that for 45, 50 years, right? Do you have a take on the sort of the explosion of these techniques and why it occurred now, and how does it feel to see this kind of work impacting our daily lives so immensely?
Well, to begin with, I've never been one to go back and repolish what I've done under a different name. In fact, it was a bit painful for me to prepare this talk because, in general, I don't like going back. I like going ahead. And this was really the first time in a long, long time that I had to really stop and think and go back. But getting to your question, I think that there's just a natural evolution, and sometimes we're ahead of our time. When I was working at Douglas, remember I told you I was very lucky the first year to have that 1 year to study. And one of the things that I was able to do is I found out about the work of Professor King Sun Fu at Purdue University on reinforcement learning control systems. He actually was a very famous professor. A little side story, I believe Purdue got the first engineering research center. Now imagine this, he's the director or co-director, and they're back at NSF at the banquet to celebrate this, and he gets a heart attack and drops dead. Can you imagine that?
Happens to controls people a lot.
But anyway, so we were limited by the computer power. You know, we could come up with algorithms and stuff, but there was no way that we could implement those things back then. And so Moore's Law, etc., thank goodness for that. I was just reading an article about that in the Spectrum, has enabled us to do marvelous things. And so, although one could go back and you could say, well, you know, people worked on those things 40 years ago. It's like a tie. I had a friend who said, never throw your ties out because they'll come back. We used to wear these wide ties, then we had the skinny ones. But you know, they come back, but they never come back the same. They may be wide, but they're different, a different flavor. And I think that's what happened with all these areas too, okay? Learning systems, yeah, it's hot now, but it's not the same as it was back then. There's different thinking because 40 years went by. There has to be. So that's sort of my answer.
Okay. So one of the other themes that you hit upon multiple times was changing directions. You described 3 or 4 major direction changes in your research, and also moving into different communities, different domain-specific knowledge fields, like seismology signal processing, for example. How long would you say, so one question would be, what kind of advice would you give to a younger researcher who is thinking about moving into a new area? And then, as a follow-up to that, what is your estimate of the amount of time it takes to come up to speed on the domain-specific knowledge? Like when you entered seismic signal processing, you knew the signal processing, but how long did it take you to feel like you knew your way around one of those conferences or the terminology?
You know, at my age, one question at a time.
Oh, sorry. This is the real comedian.
Two-part question.
That's right.
Okay, well, for starters, I think having worked in industry for 11 years, where you don't get You know, if you're lucky, you work on something for a year, 2 years, and then you're off on another thing. So that maneuverability, I think, made it very comfortable for me to want to move around and not just stay in one area. But I'm not going to kid you. I mean, except for the seismic, which I did come up, it's really the students. That is, the students find an area, gee whiz, yeah, run with it, and see where it goes. Now, in these application fields, these interdisciplinary fields, I'm a very strong believer, again, from my control system background, where you have to understand the plant. If you're doing biomedical, if you don't understand the human body and all of that, how can you do meaningful stuff? So from the very beginning in the 70s when I came here and got into the seismic, my students had to take a minor in theoretical geophysics. And I sat in on those courses, and it took a long time. More recently, 12, 13 years ago, the School of Engineering got the Chevron-funded center, CSOF, the Center for Integrated Smart Oil Field Technology, that Iraj Urshaki is the director of. And really, Chevron was very generous with us. They knew that except for Urshaki, none of us were petroleum engineers. But again, I mean, if you're going to do something in that kind of an area, the students have to understand, in this case, petroleum engineering. So I think when you move into these interdisciplinary areas, you and your students have to be willing to understand the plant. And that can take time. When I think back on the seismic data processing, okay, I was this young control theory Turk, enamored and in love with state variables and Kalman filtering and stuff like that. And I mentioned that, yeah, okay, I realized you could solve this decon problem using filtering and smoothing. And so we use state variable models. Well, the geophysical idea, they didn't understand what the heck I was talking about. And it took me a long time until I realized that it was my job to communicate in their language, not their job to understand it in my language. And I think if you work in interdisciplinary fields, that's part of what you have to develop, the ability to communicate in someone else's language if you want to sell something that you really believe is good. And so when I showed those 2 books on deconvolution, the black one, that's all in state equation terminology. The red one, convolutional model, they understood that. And what I came to realize is that all these algorithms stuff that were great, you know, they didn't care about those details. That was what you used to solve the problem. They needed to be explained in terms of their model. And so that's why I rewrote it. But that took probably 7 or 8 years. But of course, once I realized that, then in working in other areas, I realized how important it was to talk in terms of the language of the people.
So I have kind of an off-the-wall question for you. So I looked at your resume, sort of, and you've published over roughly 500 papers and 9 books, and you mentioned that this is time-consuming. How long do you think it takes to write a book? Or are you a really great typist?
Ask my wife.
Too long. Too long, right? Just to give a feel for.
Well, okay, I can tell you that on average it's a 3-year affair. Yeah. Even today, the last book on Introduction to Type 2 Fuzzy Logic Control, where I worked with 4 other authors. You know, when you're the lead author, that means you're going to do a lot of the work, all the integration, etc. That took 3 years. Getting a notation, everybody to agree on the notation, the ordering of the author, and then integrating so that it doesn't read like a research monograph, but there's a flow, okay? Because we didn't want it to be a research monograph. Now, it's not a textbook, so it's somewhere between them. But I would say maybe the only book that I wrote that was faster was the one that I did with Don Gruey on perceptual computing. But he and I were able to interact very fast together, and you can attest to how fast he is. But even that was a 2-year. How long did it take you to write your book?
Probably about 2 years.
Yeah, there you go. See? Yeah, I mean, and you have to drop something. So you have to give up something when you're doing this. So I always advise, I always advise people before tenure, don't write a book, because it's an unreviewed publication, and it can really interfere with what should be your main goal, namely getting promoted. Everybody may not agree with me, but it is an unreviewed publication.
So one of the other things that you talked about that really resonated with me, and I suspect with a lot of the other people in the room, is this joy of discovery and joy of research. And so I have a couple questions. I will ask them one at a time on that. The first one is, you mentioned this idea of like you're at a talk and then you have to go out of the room because you just want to start working on it and you can't stop working on it. So I think most of the researchers in the room probably have had that experience.
Yeah.
And then you have this sort of feeling, I don't know, maybe you do, I had this feeling. It's sort of fun if you think you're the only person on the planet right now that knows this thing. It usually turns out not to be true, right? But it's a great feeling. So my question is, when you have that feeling, how long does it take for you to share it with somebody? A student, a colleague? Do you hold it for a week, a day, months?
God, you know, I've never thought of it.
But if you think
Never thought along those lines.
Yeah, just curious.
I mean, on the seismic thing, I had to work out the equations, and then I had to write the paper. But then my student, John Cormilo, showed up, and I don't write programs, so he was good at converting it all, and then he saw other things that could be done. So it was going on in parallel. But, you know, you get to a point where you want to share it. Yeah. No, I'm not like someone who collects great art and has it stored in a private room and sits in front of it. Oh, my equation.
No, quite to the contrary. Do you need to rush and share? Maybe you don't want to store it in a vault, but do you need to rush and share immediately?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you can't sit on this thing because maybe decades ago, technology was moving much slower. Today, man, you got to get this thing into print because things get out and people are very fast. And if you don't get it, somebody else is going to get it. So if you think you have something good, yeah, you better get it out there quickly.
So how would you compare your time at Douglas in that regard? I mean, were there things there that you did that you were excited about that you weren't able to share, and then was that part of the thing that you liked about academia?
Oh, well, again, I was in a very unique position at Douglas. Everything I did was unclassified. And I could write papers and publish them. So I got into that do the research and publish mode while I was at Douglas. Yeah.
So the other question I had on the subject, I've had conversations with Sri and Sandeep on this joy of engineering, joy of discovery. Do you have any thoughts on how we can expose young people to this aspect of engineering so it doesn't seem so dry and bland, and that you don't have to become a junior before you start to experience this joy of engineering and discovery?
Well, earlier this year, Sandeep had me going around and speaking with faculty about the MS and the PhD program and what we can do to enhance the PhD program. And I thought that Alice Parker came up with a very good suggestion that creating a course where faculty would come in and focus on the way they solve problems. What's the approaches that they use? That would be very interesting, very different kind of a course, because we all approach things differently. So you use one kind of approach, you use another, and maybe there's a way to put together something so that the students would look at that and there would be the excitement as, you know, why did you do that? Kind of a thing. I don't know if that completely answers it.
It's along the lines.
No, but I think that this is something that our PhD students pick up from their advisors. I'm sure that all the PhD advisors have to be excited about what they're doing, and they have to transmit that to their students.
Sure. Yeah, along those lines, this isn't really a question, but I think Sandeep or Sri mentioned that I was a student here, so I took your class. You probably remember me.
You contributed problems to the second edition of my book.
Yeah, Jerry would give us homeworks while he was revising his books, and the homeworks were to write some good problems for my second edition. So
he wrote very good problems. I put the names of the students in the second edition.
Credited.
You probably have more problems with your name
I
next.
have plenty of problems. But it's not really a question, but it's, when I was thinking about preparing for this, it struck me, you know, when you learn something really fundamental, like in your class, the estimation theory class 563, which I took, and all of my PhD students have had to go through your class, such a fundamental course, that you learn, like when I learned Kalman filtering, for example, I walked in, I didn't know anything about it. You know, a couple of weeks, I got the picture, right? And so I can never really decouple Kalman filtering from you, right? And the way you presented it. So it's, you have this sort of ripple effect on people. And if you share your enthusiasm with it, it ripples down. And I can't tell you how many times, I mean, I don't do research focused on Kalman filtering, but I've many, many times in my own research and then in industrial application, something will come up and I'll say, well, you know what solves that problem is a Kalman filter. And so it's, every time I think of that, I think of you and
Oh, you should think of Kalman.
I can't really decouple it. I shouldn't.
Actually, it's kind of interesting. Kalman really doesn't think that his biggest contribution was the thing that we call the Kalman filter. In fact, he can be very verbal about what he feels are his. He never got the IEEE Medal of Honor for the Kalman filter. He got it for being able to decompose the subspaces of linear systems, and everything else sort of follows from that. But it's kind of funny as to what really becomes important later on. I'm sure he didn't turn down the $500,000 he got from the NAE for the importance of the Kalman filter, because he feels it's not his most important contribution. But he did get that. It's one of those big cash awards for, you know, something that...
Did you have surprises like that in your career, like something that you
I
did?
never got a $500,000.
I know. Sorry, Sri might have a surprise for you.
No, I
Not
don't
for
think
you,
so.
Jerry.
But were there things that you thought this is going to set the world on fire, and other things that you thought, well, this is so-so, and then it turns out one was great, and the other one kind of was never realized?
You know, I think we have to be enthusiastic about what we're doing. Only time can tell what survives. I mean, the literature is filled with so much stuff. You publish hundreds of articles. How many of those are really going to survive the test of time? There's a lot of luck there, really a lot of luck. But I don't think that's the question that I would ask. I would just say, okay, what's interesting to me now? Where do I think, you know, I can make a contribution? You do the best you can and see what happens. I mean, is there anybody here who can look into a crystal ball and say, yeah, what I'm doing? I didn't even think George Moore knew when he drew his curves that was going to be so important.
So I wanted to touch on something that you didn't really go into detail on, and then I'll pull up some of your slides here so people can see Jerry's sense of humor. Which was the time that you spent as chair and how that came about, and your experience as chair. Maybe let me pull up the slides. And
Okay,
talk, and maybe
well,
we can talk about some of your students, because I'm interested.
Yeah, go ahead. But while you're doing that, so I became chair in 1984. So I came here in 74, and Nasser Nahi was the chair. And in 1978, very tragic, he passed away suddenly. And Caprillion asked George Becky whether he would step back in, because we were like, you know, one day we had a chair, the next day we didn't have a chair. And George is fantastic. He said, okay, I'll do it. We were a small department. But even then, George realized he needed help. And so he asked Len Silverman to be his associate chair. And then Caprillion passed away suddenly, I think in 1980. And George felt he owed it to Caprillion to have taken that, but said, okay, that's it. Somebody else has to do it now. And Len became the chair, and Len asked me to be associate chair. I don't know whether there were any. I think I asked, I mentioned to, I'm sure we elected him. Who else wanted the job? And so I told Len, I said, no, I think the department has to elect me associate chair. And remember, Caprillion passed away, I think, in '80. Saul, you know all this. And we didn't get a real dean until '84. There was a period of time where the School of Engineering was run by a committee. I'm not kidding. And we had one search, we almost had a dean, and we didn't. And then Len Silverman became dean. By that time, we had moved over from Powell Hall into Salvatore. And when Len became dean, I became department chair. Yeah, and I guess it was voted. I don't remember those details. And those were very heady days. Maybe you want to show your things before I get into my little cartoons.
Few slides. I have just one picture. It's like you said, you can really harvest good images off of just the internet. So I have a couple here for you. So these are pictures of Professor Mendel through the years. Google image search is my credit here. So this is Jerry today. You know, love. This is Jerry. You'll have to date these for us, Jerry.
What's on the blackboard?
It looks like seismic stuff, I would say. So.
That looks like an array. That's my virtual sensor.
Okay.
It's back in the higher order statistics days.
Okay, got another one here.
Notice the mustache.
Yeah, it's key. So this is you with some of your students.
Oh, yeah.
You recognize
Hey,
these guys?
Bob, you're in it.
There you go.
Yeah, the guy right next to me is Robert Locally. That's Giannakis with the beard? Maybe. That's Swami over there. And then we had this Japanese visitor.
I talked to Swami. He wanted to know if you're going to be dancing on a table in a tavern in Greece anytime next year.
So you want to hear that story?
Sure. I think that was the intention.
Okay, well, Swami and Giannakis, we became pretty good friends. And maybe it was in 1995, they organized a workshop on statistical signal processing, not on higher order statistics, but it was on the island of Corfu. And there was a banquet at the end, and it was in a very large taverna. Letty was there, so she can attest to the truth of what I'm going to tell you. And I don't know, somehow we found ourselves sitting at a table that was right next to the big floor where the show was going to go on, and I think John Proakis was sitting at this table. And so then they have the entertainment, and the first thing they did was belly dancing. Okay, they had a few women, and they go into the belly dance routine, and then they ask people to volunteer, and all of a sudden I find myself volunteering. And the first thing they do is they rip the shirt from the front of your pants, so your belly is out there, and you do the belly dance. I'm a good sport. Okay, so I go back to the seat. Then they continue, and these two male guys bring out these little tables. I mean, you know, we're talking a square table here. And they jump up and they're dancing, and the women are coming down from the audience, and they're stepping up onto the table and they're dancing with them. The next thing I know, they're dragging me out, and I'm on a table. I'm on a table, and the women are coming up, and I'll never forget. Well, I'm dancing with one. I said, no dips. So a couple of years later, I was in charge of a workshop, probably on higher order statistics, in Banff, actually, the Canadian Rockies. And for the entertainment, I had gotten a Western-themed show that not only included hoop dancing, but there were cowboys that came in with their guns and a hanging loop to hang people. And so they wanted to know, who should they hang? So I pointed out Giannakis and Swami. You get those two guys. And so afterwards I laughed because they went through this whole thing, and so I said, you know something, guys? I forgive, but I never forget.
Yeah, that picture was given to me by Giannakis, and
Oh, yeah?
Swami also passed on serious regards as well. Said
good.
he was
Yeah.
inspired by your research and your teaching enthusiasm. So let me flip through some of these other slides and you can narrate. So we saw Jerry with the mustache, without the mustache, and I'm not very good on the computer, but I image searched about the 5th hit for Jerry Mendel on Google Images. He has a soul puff, actually. It's amazing. I'm not kidding, Jerry. That's number 5 for when you search.
Really? Wow.
That's Howie Mendel.
No relative.
Yeah, no relation, huh? So Jerry had given me these other slides. I'll pop up and then he can narrate.
Oh,
This is
yeah,
from
yeah.
his time as chair.
Okay,
So
so
I'll flip and you narrate.
okay, so when I was chair, every chair has, the biggest problem is space, right, Mo? Space. You can never have enough space. Okay? So we had this big space problem, and I used to have an annual party for the faculty and the staff at my house. And so for the 1985 one, I created some awards in the EE Systems Space contest. And so there were 5 of them, and I had gotten my Apple Mac, and I loved playing around with it, and it had Mac Paint and the spray cans. And so what you're going to see, this was all done on this 128K machine with Mac Paint. It was fun, though. So the first award, this was the 5th prize. You can read these things. Okay, and then go to the 4th prize. Then the 3rd prize.
For the younger people in the audience, this building didn't exist back when Jerry was chair. It was all in Salvatorian PHE. Yeah.
And then the 2nd prize. And now for the 1st prize. I had so much fun doing these. I wish we had a building like that Mobius Hall. We'd have no problem.
But doesn't it have a finite surface area even though it has...
Did I what?
Doesn't it have finite surface area? Mobius Hall still has a finite surface area, right?
Don't get into this is why your humor doesn't work at the department. Jerry, don't get into the details. Leave it to the professionals. So I've got many more questions, but I thought maybe it would be nice to take some questions from the audience, because I'm sure a lot of
students, yeah.
Questions from the faculty or students. Let me shut off the test pattern too, so we're not.
So, floor is open.
How do I shut this off?
Oh boy.
So, since you've been always ahead of your time, could you tell us what the next big thing is going to be?
Can you talk a little louder?
Since you've always been ahead of your time,
Oh.
can you tell us what the next big thing is going to be?
Jerry, I'll
Oh.
you want to repeat it?
Oh,
Yeah.
gee whiz, okay.
No, you can stand there, but
Okay, so Ubli said, what's the next big thing? Big data. That's big. If I was still active, again, I only look at certain things. I would definitely be jumping into that area. And also social networking, those kinds of areas. But I think I also would be getting much more involved in what USC has to offer, namely the ability to do some really good interdisciplinary work, being able to work with people at the medical school. God, that's fantastic. Okay? So I'd be looking around for opportunities like that.
That was my next question, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Chuck's in the name.
Yeah. How about a student? Do we have a student? Don't be shy. Have the microphone. I can bring it up to you. Okay, great.
If you can go, if you could go back 50 years ago, what would you do differently? Do you have any hesitations?
Actually, that's an interesting question that occasionally I think about. And so I say, well, would I have given up the 11 years in industry to have had, 51 years? And my answer is no, I wouldn't have, because it was a very unique time in industry to be working. And I got to work on so many different things that I think later, as I said, informed my entire career. As far as here, I might have spent more time. Well, I would have to think about that. There's the issue. Do you stay in one area for almost your whole career, or do you move into different areas? I'd have to think about that. But like I said, most of it was not my choice. It was students who reoriented me. And I think that's the fantastic thing about being at a university. It can happen. Nobody says you can't do it. Now, of course, you better get grants to support it, but usually that happens. Other questions?
So Jerry, our field, electrical engineering, right? It's been evolving quite a bit, particularly in recent times, and it's getting broader and so on. And also, as educator, you've been thinking a lot about education, also electrical engineering education. So, what do you think? Our department, should go in terms of both, these kinds of research directions. You can't do everything, but also, how we educate our students, both, in classroom and outside.
When I was chair, I had workshops each year. And one of the things that I really wanted was to create what I called the mega department. That is the combining of EE with computer science. And I still feel that that's a good thing to do. It'll never happen here because too many years have gone by. MIT, Berkeley, maybe Michigan. They've done it. And when you do something like that, really great things can happen. And we can see in computer science, decades ago, I always used to kid Mel. I said, you guys talk in zeros and ones and we talk in continuum. But that's changed in computer science now. They've got robotics, they've got games, they've got learning systems, and why do they have, we also work on things that use that, but this boundary that exists between us makes it difficult to collaborate. I realize it's never going to happen here because we'd be this one monster department and the other departments would be terrified by that.
Yeah, it's a good point. That was another question I was going to ask you is, in artificial intelligence, machine learning, these deep learning, which is basically multi-layer neural nets, have really taken off. And so I was thinking about your work on the fuzzy logic and related work, and I think in order to get it to take off to that magnitude, because it is data-driven, you need the computer scientists to take it over.
Absolutely. I've been telling the signal processing faculty, we deal with data, they look at data, we look at things differently, but boy, if you put it all together, it's dynamite. Yeah.
So, how about one of the junior faculty from signal processing, Justin or Miriam or Panos, or any questions?
I can ask a question. So,
Okay. Here you go.
You mentioned.
Let me bring this to you.
I talk pretty loud.
We got to get you on the record.
All right. So you mentioned your first years in industry, and today I think we see a different industry than when you were out there. First of all, there is I believe, a lot more boundaries in terms of transferring knowledge or at least data from industry to academia, because basically they have these huge systems, huge amounts of data, and they work differently. The other thing is that they are actually doing their own research, developing their own systems, and they push research into a different direction, which is more data-driven as opposed to knowledge, modeling-driven, which is what we're trying to do. How do you see things back then and today, and how the relationship between academia and industry has changed, and whether this is a good thing, bad thing, what can be done about
Well,
this relationship?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, Robert, you had a fellowship from Hughes. Did Hughes have in-house courses?
But Hughes is not the same place.
Yeah, no, but the question is, didn't Hughes have in-house courses where you learned about the products and the systems?
There's some of that, but mostly Hughes at the time was fantastic. You would learn about something, walk down the hallway, this guy knew missile guidance, this guy knew estimation theory, this guy knew, radar signal processing, and you just knew who the experts were. And there was enough money in the system that everybody was very gracious with their time. And if you were interested, someone would tell you what you wanted to know or give you references. Good, because it was awash with money.
Well, David, when we were at Douglas used to have in-house courses. They didn't necessarily expect the new hires to immediately be able to solve problems. There was a time when you were given to ramp up and learn. The reason I mention that is because from what I see is that that's different today. And that's affected the way we teach and educate. That the students are being hired today have to immediately come in and start solving problems. Even though they don't understand the product line, they got to start solving problems. And so that affects the whole educational process. It used to be that we'd say, well, education is a lifelong process, and what you're learning is providing you with the fundamentals that you can use later and throughout your career. I'm not so sure that that's true anymore. That is, the students come in and they want to learn, for example, programming. I want to know programming because when I take that telephone interview or my Skype interview, they're going to ask me to write a program, and I better be able to do it or else I'm not going to get a job. Okay. So that influences then what we have to teach and how we have to teach. I'm not saying it's bad, it's just different. I think we have to adapt to it.
Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
Maybe one more question from
Final question.
students?
I did, yeah.
Jerry, you and I were brought up, as you've mentioned, in the same school at Douglas, and we both came to deeply appreciate and remember the necessity in many problems to understand the physical system or the plant, as you've called it. Now, today, I feel there's a trend that people think, and maybe they're correct, that they can use big data as a substitute for figuring out the plant. So you mentioned with your students in the middle of your lecture here that you always made them study their physical system that they were going to analyze. Do you think that balance is being maintained, or it can all be done with this big data, massive computing?
Well, obviously my answer is no, it can't all be done. But I think what's happened today is that there are classes of problems at the Googles and the Amazons where there isn't where there isn't anything like Newton's laws.
Sure.
Okay, how do you describe those things? Right now, there's just the data. Maybe someday a Newton will emerge who makes some sense out of what they're trying to do. But right now, they just got lots of data, lots of data. Let me be focusing on what I've done for CSOF. CSOF deals with how do you get more petroleum out of the ground. It's as simple as that. And every oil field is different. And although the petroleum engineers take courses where they learn how to model, These are very complicated three-dimensional partial differential equation models, and they need parameter functions that frankly are not available, okay? And the oil wells are being instrumented, and talk about big data, they got gobs of data. They got tens of thousands of wells that are instrumented and sending data up the gazoo. And so from a system point of view, they have what I would call input-output data, okay? And so that's big data. And so it's possible that you can do something with that that they can't do trying to use whatever kind of partial differential equation models that they use that they have a hard time validating anyway. So I think that it's important that students get a balance. That is, when they go into an area like communications, boy, they better learn the theory of communications. But then maybe if they're applying it, to something, maybe all they have is data, and they have to come up with some kind of a data-driven solution. But to me, what's really interesting is getting back to observing things and seeing something that's unusual. Let's take this deep learning, for example. Okay? Something is going on there. And when you see something that's going on, there's got to be a reason for it. And that means someone, I don't know who, has got to be able to formulate the problem mathematically and figure out and explain what's going on. When that happens, that changes the ballgame. Until that happens, people can do this, they can do that, they can claim this and claim that, and nobody really understands why.
Yeah, one thing that it seems hasn't emerged in that area is a mixture of the two models, like exploiting what you know about the problem and then throwing learning algorithms at the rest. People go to one extreme or the other. And I mean, your research has spanned, model-based, Kalman filtering to the fuzzy logic, which is more data-driven. So, but to combine those two really is something, because it's moving very quickly in industry.
But I think that the students have to learn the tools of both approaches now. Maybe that's what's happened. That back, let's say in the old days, we didn't have all this data. We didn't have the computer power, and so we relied a lot more on simple models. Now, my God, with the computer power and all this data, we have to figure out what to do with that. But I agree. I think that somehow what you know about the system has to also be used. So it's like solving a big constrained optimization problem where right now maybe people aren't imposing physical constraints or whatever the constraints will be, but I think eventually there'll be a merging. That's just my forecast.
Any other questions?
Any final thoughts, questions? If not, let's thank Jerry and Keith.